Thank you very much, Steve, and I also want to thank you again for the kind invitation to speak here. The topic of this talk is actually focused on a mode of reasoning that all of us do in the course of scientific investigation, but is almost never explicitly, I think, even acknowledged or formalized. And so I would like to start with a bit of history about where this notion of abduction came from, how it compares with two of the conventional modes of reasoning that I think we're all exposed to, namely deduction and induction, and then start asking questions about what can be done and why is it even important to think about organizing the process of abduction. And of course, en route, we want to ask, can this buy you anything that maybe has been missing from a lot of empirical strategies, methodological schemes? I think the answer to that question is that there's quite a bit that can be gained from the attempt to organize abduction. And en route, we will run into a considerable range of unsolved problems. So anybody that decides that they want to indeed get their feet wet in this area, there's no shortage of what to do. So to get started, this is a subject that actually began with Charles Sanders Peirce in 1860. And over a span of about 50 years, he developed ideas focused on abduction. And the basic idea here is that this is it's essentially a process of reasoning from effects to causes. Now, that's kind of a reverse direction from what you're usually hearing about, and depending upon whose statistics course, or depending upon, I should say, the orthodoxy of it, they may tell you that that's something you should never do. But that's really what abduction is about. So here is one indication. It's a situation where you pass from observation of certain facts to the supposition of a general principle to account for the facts, which means the process of hypothesis generation is very much in the middle of this. And one of the questions that immediately comes to mind when you start thinking about the organization of abduction is, where do hypotheses come from? Well, that immediately leads you to the question of, to what extent can we understand the discovery process? And can you suddenly can you really get some insight into how people suddenly look at a body of evidence and say, aha, I see reasonable explanations, hypotheses for it? A firm answer to that is not something I can provide. However, to the extent that anybody has input on that, I think it would be welcome in a lot of places. So, inference from a body of data to an explaining hypothesis, or from effect to cause. So, starting with Peirce, this again, as I say, began in 1860, and just to quickly differentiate it from deduction, where that actually starts with hypotheses, and where you're now deducing through a agreed upon chain of logic consequences to be tested. That's kind of standard with with what I think everybody's familiar with. Induction is indeed a process of testing hypotheses, but the hypotheses are already there. And most of the, in fact, virtually all of the standard statistical literature which deals with hypothesis testing has virtually nothing to say about where the hypotheses came from. So abduction is really very much of a different game. Now, let me just quickly mention a couple of contexts where all of you are familiar with the process of abduction, but I think it's may not have been explicated that way. One is medical diagnosis. So what is a physician confronted with? A patient comes in, presents with a set of symptoms. Then, following the physician's consideration of symptoms, there may be a set of laboratory tests carried out. Then there's an interview, which amounts to collecting a patient history. So already at that point, you've got at least, if you like, three kinds of evidence. One is the symptomatology, the other is the result of laboratory tests, the third is the history elicited, And it can indeed get more elaborate than that, but the main point here is that you have already 3 different kinds of evidence, all of which you have sitting in front of you, and the physician's task is to ask, what's the problem? Find out the cause. So that's one obvious place. A second concerns criminal investigations. There's a scene of a crime. There's a murder. There's a variety of clues, some of which may be subject to analysis in forensic laboratories, some of which may be interview with people who may have been close to the scene of the crime. And there's one aspect of the criminal investigation that will differ from the physician's problem, namely, in the course of collecting evidence, particularly by talking to other people, there's frequently a reason to give you deceptive information. So the process of deception is out there, and anybody involved with criminal investigation has got to be able to weigh up evidence, which is not only of varying quality of the sort that you may find depending upon what's in a forensic lab or what you find from, if you like, obvious artifacts at the scene of a crime, but you have to also weigh the extent to which different informants are giving you deceptive information. And in the end, what do you want to do? You need a hypothesis that says one of possibly a list of 2, 3, 4, it can be many people, are responsible for the crime. And the idea here is to ask, what is an adaptive process of working your way through these multiple forms of information to land on a statement and be able to defend it that says person B is the one. Now, in the readings, I don't know the extent to which you've looked into it. I intentionally had one there, which was a direct side-by-side comparison of a Sherlock Holmes story together with Pierce's formulation of abduction. And it was very much intentional just to emphasize the point that the criminal investigation is kind of a good paradigm to start thinking about this. So that at least kind of gets you started. There's to get at an even simpler level where you might think about this, in the mathematics, physics, I guess more physical science literature, there are what are usually called inverse problems. So what does that mean? You can view abduction as one of those too. So if you're in the world of differential equations, most of the literature about differential equations that you're used to seeing says, here's an equation system, how do we solve? As opposed to the inverse problem, which says, here's a function, here's a class of equations, 2 questions. Are any of the equation systems in your list candidates to describe what you've seen? And if so, can you uniquely identify what it is? And for fun, I'll just mention what's become something of a classic paper on inverse problems by Joe Keller in the math department at Stanford, who wrote an expository piece in the American Math Monthly that I think I like to at least recommend to anybody. And his opening inverse problem represents a question we can ask of all of you. He says, you're all used to seeing, in fact, in a lot of these intelligence tests of one sort or another, somebody gives you a sequence of numbers and says, what's the next number in the sequence? So he starts out with one of those, and the numbers are 4, 14, 33, 42, 72. And the question is, what's the next number in the sequence? Anybody know? 4, 14, 33, 42, 72. Okay. Before I tell you, let me just indicate that if you only think in terms of numerical sequence, you'll be at this forever. And it's a good example where additional context is critical, which also goes with the abduction process, because if you spent a lot of your time in Manhattan, you will realize that those are the express stops on the 7th Avenue IRT line. And if you haven't spent a lot of time in New York, you won't know that. So you have an affair getting at this inverse problem. Okay, so with this much at hand, now let me tell you a bit about what I want to do both today and next time. I want to start with a sequence of somewhat more complicated examples. I like to do all of this through example because I think it illustrates how the process works, the abduction process, and also will allow us to focus on where there's a fair number of uncharted topics that need addressing. So the first thing I want to discuss is identification of the mechanics of the rice irrigation system on the island of Bali in Indonesia. And this has a long history in terms of investigation, at least by people from outside Bali who wanted to find out what exactly is this animal here and how does it work. And a lot of it began with work of the anthropologist Clifford Geertz going back into the 1950s, and then was taken up in a very extensive way by Steve Lansing roughly about 25 years ago. So the reasons for a lot of detective work being involved in multiple lines of evidence in terms of pinning down what is this system and how is it differentiated from the structure of rice irrigation systems elsewhere in Asia, to say nothing of other parts of the world, will become apparent in a few minutes. But that's what I wanted to introduce because it has all the features of this medical diagnostic and criminal investigation situation, but more complicated in the sense that there's more kinds of evidence of diverse character that you have to bring to bear. And it's the process of merging evidence of diverse character and accumulating it over time that we like to think about in terms of organizing and getting a, if you like, more precise view of abduction. After the Bali rice fields, then I want to switch to something which is closer to the criminal investigation. This is a chemical and biological weapons convention violation, or a claim of it. And there's something called the Yellow Rain controversy. And this has to do with claims by the US government together with Canadians, British, that the Soviet Union, in fact, had been using chemical and biological weapons in Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Afghanistan in the 1970s. And that's a much more complicated discussion than the Bali rice fields. But what it has in common with at least the criminal investigation is now you're in the business where there's deception, and there's an intent to deceive, because to be able to substantiate at least the claims of the Western governments about this, it would be a major, to put it mildly at the very least, international embarrassment for, at that time, the Soviet Union. But as we'll see, there's a very intricate and diverse set of evidence that needs to be assembled. Now, one of the ways in which the Yellow Rain controversy evidential base will be distinguished from what you'll see in the Bali irrigation scheme, that will be a place where we'll try to start to get reasonably quantitative. It will be a mix of both quantitative and qualitative, but in the end, you'd like to have some quantitative scoring across a diverse set of forms of evidence, so that at least the quantitative information can hopefully get you a more precise picture of whether or not you can defend the asserted accusation about use of chemical and biological weapons or not. Or is it something that's strictly up in the air? Now, in going from the strictly qualitative into the quantitative domain, one then moves a bit further and starts to ask the question, there's going to be this myriad of forms of evidence out there from all different sources, and at some point you get to a position where you say, there's more here than the human mind can digest at one shot. Can we get help from some other technology, namely computers? And the question is there some notion of computerization of the abduction process so that you could deal with problems vastly more complicated than either the Bali rice fields or the Yellow Rain setup? And having posed this question, I should say, to the best of my knowledge, it's really the computer science community that's taken this up in a very serious way. And it started first in the 1960s with a seemingly harmless sounding problem that was produced, or a question produced to Josh Lederberg, a well-known molecular biologist. I don't like to restrict him to that. He was kind of a jack of many trades and amazingly an expert of many of them. But The question posed to him was simply this. The US government is going to send up a rocket to Mars, and you can make measurements, hopefully as simple as possible. And the question is, what are the measurements you would make and the analyses you would do on them if you wanted to answer the question, is there life on Mars? So that's the question. And of course, you can't fly arbitrarily heavy technical equipment to Mars. It's got to be fairly lightweight stuff. You're dealing with the computer capacity of the late 1960s and 1970s, so you can't talk about any of the, if you like, computers that are even operating in this room right now. And so there's limited computing capacity, but nevertheless, this general question. So Lederberg's initial answer was mass spectrometry should be the technology used in terms of at least doing the measurements. And then the question, and you ask, well, where is that going to get us? This is a technique for being able to identify, let me say, classes of organic compounds, because that's what you're going to look for if you want to see, are there signs of life on Mars? But the question is, on the basis of mass spectrometry data, can you uniquely identify the molecules? Well, the answer is no, at least just with that much technology. But you can vastly restrict the class of such molecules that operate. So then you need other things to be brought in. What do you know about the if you like, atmospheric pressure on Mars? What do you know about temperatures? All those things. Can you have stable molecules of particular kinds? All that information enters into answering the question, what are the molecules you see, and can you say that, well, this is a good indication there's life on Mars? Well, that actually led to the first so-called expert system. This is, depending upon whose vocabulary you like, it's the domain of artificial intelligence. I frankly prefer the language expert system because if you say artificial intelligence, I think there ought to be triple the emphasis on the word artificial relative to the word, to the word intelligence, because it's an understanding of human intelligence, I think, is heavily waiting to happen, but the artificial is certainly there. Anyway, with expert systems, you're hoping to have computers be able to do a lot of the work that a really good chemist can do. And so, but a really good chemist can't be plowing through a candidate list of molecules that can run on the order of a couple 100,000. And that's the nature of the problem. So if you don't have additional help in terms of the automation process, then you have a problem. So I do want to discuss the Dendral system and how it got going, because that literally was the beginning of the vast expert system industry that's grown up since then. There is, it's not exactly a reading, it's a link to a website that I put up with the rest of the readings to a artificial intelligence, or if you like, expert system called MySyn. Now that is entirely devoted to medical diagnosis. And it can deal with quite elaborate diagnoses, and so it takes in the same information that a physician would about a given patient, but now you ask, can you automate the logic and the reasoning that a physician would carry out in order to make a diagnosis? And if the answer is yes, well then MySyn ought to be able to at least compete with what you would call a moderately competent physician, and if it's really doing its thing, it ought to be able to outdo a lot of them in nailing down correct diagnoses. Well, a contest indeed was conducted with the early versions of MySyn, and in terms of diagnoses that eventually got pinned down, MySyn was correct about 69 to 70% of the time, which is about the batting average for physicians anyway, with diagnoses. So that was at least the start. Now, there have been much more elaborate medical diagnostic systems set up since MySyn was put in place. We'll say a little bit about some of those. This will go on tomorrow. And all of this is, again, part of this exercise in abduction. Now, the one thing that will come into play, and I'll say a bit about it as we go through at least a couple of examples today, is this seemingly endless discussion about what do you mean by evidence of causality. Now, I want to discuss an aspect of it that I think probably lies outside of the domain of what you're used to in any course that deals with statistical notions of causality, and I think it's outside of the domain of what you would see in an econometrics course, but it basically goes this way. People involved in medical diagnosis, criminal investigation, and so on, they are making causal inferences, not on the basis of any kind of replication. It's on the basis of seeing something happen once. And frequently, they're very accurate about it. And you ask, well, how do you understand that? Well, that is actually not an exercise that falls within, if you like, the conventional modeling literature, but does have to do with what we understand to the present time in terms of neurophysiology about how our minds work. And there's real gaps there. And the papers that I had put up for you to have a look at actually started with some work of the French psychologist Albert Maicot, who developed a line of investigation that's heavily followed right now and is devoted to questions of that kind. In particular, a lot of it focused on infants and young kids, because they actually make causal inferences about what's happening on the basis of very little prior evidence. And you know, most of the time they're right. And you ask, well, how does this work? And we won't have firm answers to the question, how does this work? But it is something that at least I wanted to put in front of you to think about, since if any of you are looking for still another line of inquiry to pursue, I think there's a lot to do in that domain as well. Oh, yes.
Maybe you can help me understand this. The example you gave was a physician making inferences based on one observation, that is the presentation of the patient,
right.
The patient's symptoms. But if I, as a physician, I'm trying to understand both the prevalence of the particular causes, so I have my priors,
yep.
and the conditional probability of the symptom given a particular cause, how is this not just a classical inference?
That gets closer to a classical inference. You're absolutely right about that. Where it won't be close to a classical inference is in this yellow rain controversy. So there you've got this a large set of data, which we'll discuss in detail, and you can't really go to other chemical biological weapons investigations that have been carried out and say, this is like one of those. So if you may have priors, but they're not empirical priors. Right. Indeed, the physician does have empirical priors, and that's highly valuable. Although, let me say one thing about this. Those priors can be very, I don't know if self-deceptive is the right word, but there's an activity that goes on in training of all physicians that many of you may have heard of called the Clinical Pathological Conference. So what is that? There's somebody that died, and there's an autopsy report, which is not made known to the people in the room. The only thing that's known to the people in the room who are at this conference is all the information that examining physicians had about the patient, except a pathologist report on cause of death. And on the basis of that information, you're supposed to come and say, okay, give me the line of reasoning that tells you the cause of death. And the error rate on that is remarkably high, given the fact that it's exactly as you say. You've got a lot of prior experience. You have priors that you form, and that's all legitimate. But I think one of the reasons for batting averages that are not necessarily high is simply the fact of a huge amount of heterogeneity from one patient to the next. And to see it in a somewhat stronger way, if you go into any standard medical textbook, you will find criteria that ought to be involved for diagnosis of a patient with disease X. Now, that list is not unique, or is not completely disjoint, I should say, from diagnostic lists that go with other diseases that may be of somewhat similar character. And it's important because which one the physician attributes all the symptoms to or all the information to can have a big role in terms of the treatment strategy. And you could be doing harm rather than good depending upon what you select. So there's the point is there's a huge amount of heterogeneity. It's not a clean situation where you've replicated the experience over and over again. Is that?
Yeah, so I mean, it would be a classical problem if I had empirical priors, but if I'm a hard frequentist and I don't believe in choosing some prior in a Bayesian fashion, then then I no longer have a classically framed decision problem.
Well, I think actually you do have a classically framed decision problem. I don't want to put this, I think, in a particularly that kind of thing in a strictly frequentist setup, because I think failure to use prior information in that kind of setting is just crazy. So yes, but then if you did well, actually I've kind of gone through this exercise with some physicians at New York Hospital about 25 years ago. You confront them all with the same patient, and these are all clinical neurologists. And then you privately ask each one. You elicit priors from them. You'd be amazed at the diversity of what you get on those priors. So, but I think, yes, use of priors there is absolutely critical. Okay, so let's shift gears now. And item 1, abduction in Bali. So what is some initial data? This is a rather complex setting in which I'll tell you some things in terms of text. I'll show you some pictures. This is actual photography of some of the key spots in Bali, because just seeing what it's like or having somebody tell you what it's like in words or showing you graphs won't quite communicate the extent of what goes on here. But we'll try in the space of about 20 minutes, 25 minutes to see what we can do with this topic. So what you've got is effectively functioning terraced rice fields. So that means there's a mountainside, and there's literally terraces built into it, and rice is growing at multiple levels in the terrace. And as most of you know, you need a lot of water to effectively grow rice. But on terraced rice fields, you don't need pumps. Gravity does all the work, and the whole trick here is how to route water from the top of the terrace system all the way down so that everybody gets an equitable share, and rice goes well through the whole watershed. And so what you see in Bali, these rice fields cover vast watersheds. They're linked by networks of streams, man-made channels, piping systems, weirs for fractionating water flow to different parts of a terrace system, and then an intricate rice cropping calendar, because everybody's not planting at the same time, for reasons we'll get into. Additional data that's there, which may seem a bit strange at the start, but a lot of questions can be raised, as you'll see from some of the photos I want to show you. There are special temples within the dense system of temples throughout Bali, and they're frequently located proximal to major junctions in rivers and channels, and this occurs throughout the watersheds. So why mention all these temples? We need a couple of background facts about Bali. Among the Indonesian islands, this one's Hindu and the rest are all Muslim. So basically you have these Hindu temples. There's lots of gods there. And if you want, if you go to Bali, a rather amazing thing that you see, if you go village after village, there's roughly twice the number of structures that you really need to house the people, because every household builds its own temple, and they're there. And that's for local prayer. Then in the community, there's also three larger temples. And then there's some of these other temples that are actually at the rice fields. Some are large, and then there's smaller ones that you find even within the terrace system. So it's praying to gods for water and successful crops and so on. So the initial thinking, and this was actually goes back to Clifford Geertz's discussion, is somehow all these temples must have something to do with how the irrigation system is at least managed, but it wasn't at all clear how, because the temples are all about religion, and running the rice field system, that's all hydrology. So what goes on? That's the first of two photographs I'll show you of what these terrace rice fields look like. Down this hillside, this is obviously fully flourishing rice throughout all levels of the terrace system, and that's just to give you a picture of what this is about. So you've got gates and pipes that release water all the way down. You can actually see water coming out through pipes at different points in this hillside. So that's the standard way the irrigation system goes. Here's another shot of one of these. And at the top of this slide is the word subak. Now, what does that mean? The management of the rice fields, and this is was something that was not so mysterious, is carried out by what are in the U.S. you would call a farmers' collective. So a subak is a collective of farmers, and what they have in common is they all own fields somewhere in this terrace system, and there needs to be some agreement about how to move water around. So the subak as a negotiating body is something one has to at least keep in mind as operating. One other thing to say about this. The farmers at the top of the terrace system, they obviously control what goes on lower down. If you have more of the water in your fields, you can get higher rice yield. So at the start of it, you think, well, there's an incentive to cheat here because the people up top, you know, they control, and to the extent they cheat, you don't have such a good crop down below. And then the question is, why doesn't that happen? Why do you see these terraces green all the way down? Well, at least 900 years ago, without the benefit of any rigorous entomology that exists as a topic right now, attempts to cheat were met by some disaster for people at the top. Why? Because in the dried out rice fields down below, you have a variety of insect pests. And the insects there that like the rice have no trouble flying up. So unless you have flooded fields all the way down, the guys on the top are in trouble. So there right away is a natural disincentive. And the fancy abduction that has to go on to fully understand this is not at that point, because that's fairly well known to anybody that's involved with rice agriculture as well as the relevant entomology. As you can see, this is not modern high-tech farming that goes on, but it tells you what it's like, at least plowing up the terraces, getting ready for a new round of planting. These are water temples, and the word water is obviously associated, and best seen, I think, in the picture at the bottom. This large temple is at a major lake, which feeds a whole terrace system for an entire watershed. And you ask, well, the temple is about religion. So what has this got to do with anything that goes on? Well, let me leave that as a question for now, but we will get some answers, because that was one of the first things that I think Clifford Geertz was asking, what is this doing out here in the middle of this lake? Then we proceed a little further. This is a map of Bali, and I only want to show it to emphasize a couple of places. There is at the upper right what amounts to a large lake, and it's next to a volcano called Mount Batur. And Lake Batur is, in fact, a substantial lake that feeds a huge watershed area. And if you go over a little bit to the left, you see some smaller lakes, and each of those diamonds up there corresponds to a volcano. Now, why do we mention volcanoes? One of the things that created all sorts of puzzles about how this irrigation system is managed is the following. You go into any watershed, you quickly discover that the full terrace system that's there is not operated by farmers from one community. And you find multiple villages are involved virtually everywhere you go in the terrace system, and that's kind of forced due to the location of the volcanoes, where the towns are, and it's the presence of the volcanoes that create this setup where you have farmers from very different communities as owners of places on the terrace system. Now, where does this enter into something that one calls a puzzle? If you go to terraced rice fields through the rest of Indonesia, you can try it in the Philippines, you can go in China. These are all top-down managed places. And frequently, particularly in China, where during the commune system, a commune had a block of terraced rice fields, and it was some top-down management that ran the whole thing. Here, there's a real question. is it a top-down management system that runs this thing, given that you have all these villages intermixed with each other? Now, what makes this something of a puzzle is that you have to come back to the Hindu part of Bali. The Indian caste system still operates. And so that's very hierarchical. And so it sounds like there must be some feuding possibly that goes on between the top of the hierarchy of different communities and so on. But nevertheless, as soon as you go inside the subaks, this is the farmers' cooperative, what you find is a complete democratic process. Everybody is if you like, inequality has been eliminated, and it's been eliminated intentionally. So they have an annual vote for who is going to be in effect the manager for that subak for the next year, in establishing what the rice cropping is going to be, so the calendar in terms of planting and harvesting, and the distribution of water. Then on top of that, any one subak can't operate alone. So there has to be a network where you go from one subak to the next, and still inequality is intentionally eliminated. And so this goes all the way up until you get to the top at Mount Batur and so on. And then they all get together, if you like, the heads of the different subaks from further down the hill, and they put together the master plan, and then it all goes. So one of the things that seems strange, at least for people as Geertz had pointed out, people coming with Western eyes, is you're always looking for this top-down management system. And it does exist. If you go, you only have to go to Java to see that. But here it doesn't. And so part of it is due to the geology, the volcano system. Part of it is due to a tension, in fact, that's put in between the hierarchy of the community with the caste system. And incidentally, you find people that are well down in the castes, often elected as the people to run the hydrology. Because as soon as they get into the to negotiating that, and if you like, the inequality has suddenly been eliminated, then it all seems to work. So that's another piece of what this is. Now here's a relationship that'll tell you between temples and water distribution, and this was not something that was discovered semi-instantaneously, but over a period of about certainly at least 30 years of investigations, starting with the temple at Lake Batur. So that's, I'm sorry, at the top of the previous map, there's a long river, and there are terraced rice fields all the way down until you get down here what's called Ulan Sui temples. And at each of these points, there's now new junction into new rice fields, new watersheds. And the same thing starts from this temple at Lake Baratan and goes through the temple of Taman Ayun and so on. And you say, well, what goes on with these temples? Well, it turns out the people from the subaks, or at least the head of each subak, goes and makes offerings at the temple that's further up the hierarchy, or I should say further upstream. Hierarchy is probably not the right way to talk about it. Then the temple of Taman Ayun is a major place, is kind of a different sort of place in that it's getting input from down this channel as well as from over here, because it's a place where, if you like, major decisions have to be made about how the water is routed. So it turns out, and this is where a lot of, if you like, major ethnography has to go on, and talking with the people at the subaks, prayers, offerings, all of that is part of the management of the irrigation system. It's not strictly hydrology. So if you take the temples out of there, you kind of lose the ability to have, if you like, offerings made from one level in the terrace system up to the next, and then there's potentially trouble. Now, to give you some visual view, this will take on something of a personal note for only 2 slides, because I couldn't find really good photos to show you elsewhere. This photograph was taken 7 weeks ago at Mount Batur, and this is my wife and myself. Batur is in the background, and that's a volcano that does erupt probably once every 27, 30 years or so. And indeed, lava does come down the hillside. The lake that you see there on the right, that is Lake Batur. That's the top of this massive watershed. And so that's one picture of what all this looks like. And the temple of Taman Ayun is this one. And it's quite different, but much larger in structure from the water temples I showed you before. But this is a place where major decisions are made. It's both prayer to gods as well as explicit management of the hydrology. Okay, so evidence leading to hypothesis formation. How do we get some sense of how this works? Well, some history and geography of Bali in comparison with other Indonesian islands. So there you see that, at least in terms of management, it looks like it's completely different in the sense that you have this democracy that operates through the subaks and through the network of subaks, and it's not a top-down management setup at all. Farm ownership in relation to village location. Virtually everywhere you go on the other islands of Indonesia and the Philippines, Malaysia, and so on, the farm owners and the village are immediately proximal to each other. That's not true here. Religion in Bali and the hierarchical structure of communities, the Indian caste system that operates, and it sets up this tension, which you ask, well, how do they manage it? Well, somehow for 1,000 years they've managed it, and that's simply there. And the centrality of subaks in all this, the farmers' cooperatives, they are critical. So it leads you to hypothesize that indeed you do have this kind of structure there. And then one asks, well, is there a test you can perform to ask, would a hierarchical system necessarily work better? Could it do what these guys are doing? Or maybe is there one in between operating and you don't even realize it? Well, there were two of what I would call natural experiments that took place on Bali about this. One was started around 1906 when the Dutch came to Indonesia. And they took a look at this irrigation system with a nice, arrogant Western attitude saying, what do these guys know about growing rice? And so they were going to change the rice cropping system and instill, in fact, put in place a top-down management scheme. And it was a disaster in terms of the rice crop for several years running. And then the Dutch, in fact, backed off, feeling that maybe these farmers knew something. That's round one. Around 1970, you had, this is in the relatively early stages of what went under the name Green Revolution. So what is that? You're producing new genetically engineered strains of rice, going after high yield. Well, with each kind of rice seed, there came a prescribed irrigation scheme for it to maximize rice yield, and there came a fertilizer scheme that also went along with it. So the initial reaction of the local farmers was, no, we don't want any part of this. There's going to be trouble. Well, a lot of pressure was brought to bear, and indeed some of the, if you like, the Green Revolution rice to get so-called high yields was put in place, managed in a top-down way, and again the rice crop collapsed. So you have those two experiments, and this wasn't obviously with any intent of getting rice crops to collapse. But the interesting thing is, in terms of the way this whole thing operates, even when you get to the top at Lake Batur, for example, at that point, that's kind of the final fine-tuning. You ask, how do people decide what they're going to do with their own fields? What actually happens is each farmer just watches what the neighbors do. From year to year, they may change the planting time a bit, the way they weed their fields, and so they have a locally defined, or at least it appears to them as though it's a local optimum they're generating. But then there's these local optima that run way up through the terrace system. And to tell you how dense this is a kind of a cartoon picture of a watershed along what are referred to as the Oust and Petanu rivers. Now, every square in here corresponds to a location of a subak. I mean, they're all over the place. And each of these, within each of these groups of farmers, they've kind of developed their own optimal scheme for growing rice and managing their own fields. And it may be a little bit different from what goes on here. What they have to live with, however, is what's the agreed upon water that's going to come through that part of the watershed. And so now you ask the question, are all these locally defined optima leading to an overall optimum system? And can you even discuss that? Well, if you look in Steve Lansing's book, this is on the reading list, they actually put together a rather nice micro-simulation model of this whole process, indicating that, yes, indeed, you could get a global optimum out of this. It's an example of, if you like, an emergent global optima from all these local ones that are in here. And they actually go through some sensitivity analyses using data from the actual rice fields and asking, by how much could you perturb some of the parameters in terms of either dates of initially planting rice, if there was some reseeding, when did it go on, in order to still maintain a good high-yield rice crop. And so they were able to reproduce a lot of what you actually see empirically. Now, there's another aspect of this where, in terms of history, where some archaeology and some genetics came into play in terms of understanding the system. Why is that? The population on Bali has not remained constant for the last 1,000 years. And so eventually you get to the point where these small communities built along sides of volcanoes get too big and they need to expand. Now, the thing is, if this was managed from the top, so that's one of the hypotheses out there, then what you might expect is that the manager at the top needs to recruit laborers who are going to work at different parts of the rice cropping system, and they may resettle to new locations, but it's not the movement, if you like, of or an extension of an entire community. So the question was, do you have a budding process where starting at, let's say, at one point along this terrace system, new communities gradually form, led by men, who then actually marry women from the village they were in. And so it's a quite tightly controlled system. And in order to assess that, two lines of evidence. One is archaeological, where you dig these cores and look at sediment, which is different when there's a rice field in a given place from when there's not. And so you can track through hundreds of years and see when new rice fields came on stream at different places from these sediment cores. And then in addition, you ask, on the basis of genetic evidence, Y chromosomes, mitochondrial DNA, a selected set of single nucleotide polymorphisms, you find that genetic variance, as you might expect, is highest at the oldest villages, works its way down. You can see this process whereby it's men from a community that are moving down, and it's women from those villages that end up as the wives. And so if you take the archaeological evidence, the genetic evidence, what you learn from the ethnography, from talking to the people in the subaks, from then learning from them about prayers, offerings that have to go on at the water temples, and what it is that is actually feeding into this full decision process, you end up, at least this is Lansing's final pitch, with the fact that yes, it is this highly democratic system that operates in tension with the community-based hierarchy through the Indian caste system, and that's the way the whole thing functions. Now, I've managed to summarize in the space of maybe 25 minutes what represents about 35 years of rather complicated research by quite a few people, but what has all this got to do with abduction? Along the way, you have these different lines of evidence being assembled. It's not all at one shot. Then you have to say, well, is this evidence all of one quality? Well, it's clearly not all of one kind, because you have the DNA analysis, you have the archaeology, you have the ethnography. A lot of people don't like to trust ethnography, but if you don't do it here, I think you don't learn much. Then you ask, well, what do they know about the hydrology and routing water? You have to use the historical experience with the test from the Green Revolution when the Dutch came in, where you tried a top-down system, the crop collapsed. So you put all that stuff together, and then you end up with the description that I've kind of just presented.
There's one thing missing. What did Geertz say?
I'm sorry?
You started with Geertz. But you never.
Oh, Geertz actually died before it all got in place.
Oh.
Well, okay, I'll tell you what he got.
Okay, I thought you had,
What
there was
Geertz,
a preliminary discussion right here.
no, Geertz got as far as understanding what the water temples did. He understood that, I think not completely, the extent to which democracy was involved when they set up this level playing field. He didn't get to the point of understanding the expansion of the villages as population grew, the new migrations. All the genetic analysis was carried out much later. And because, well, let me say more. He actually, he did pin down some more that I didn't say. He has a nice book, if you've never run across it, which I probably should have put on the reading list, called Nagara. And I think a subtitle of it approximately is, it's an analysis of what he calls the theater state of Bali. Now, what do you mean by that? You do indeed have these, in these communities, major figure like a Raja. And so you figure, these guys are going to all engage in fighting with each other, taking over other communities. But a lot of what goes on, or let me put it this way, there's a lot less of that historically that went on in Bali than had gone on other Indonesian islands. And what they ran was, it was kind of a pageant contest. So hence the name theater state. So in Bali, they have these enormously elaborate pageants at some of these big temples, like Taman Ayun. And you had basically the Rajas competing with each other in terms of the how should I say, the elaborateness of the pageant. But that didn't interfere with the actual rice cropping. So Geertz got a lot of the social structure down, but not all of it. So I don't know if that, does that? No. Steve Lansing's the one that really put this all together. He raised the problem. He went there, he said, how do you make any sense out of all this? You know, it looks as though, in principle, it shouldn't even operate, because you couldn't identify any major leader. There didn't seem to be one. All under other Indonesian islands, they had them. Yet the rice crop all worked. So the question is what to do with that. Okay? No, it wasn't. Actually, that's something would be worth putting to Lansing about the coast there, yeah. Okay, now as far as we've gotten on this is all kind of a qualitative summary. There is no quantification of these lines of evidence, although it's something in principle I guess you could do. I rather hesitate to start scoring up quality or grading evidence on a project that I haven't actually been responsible for myself. So let me shift gears to one where we can get a bit more quantification into this. If you're interested at all in the full detail on the rice irrigation system, though, I really can't sell enough this book of Lansing called Perfect Order, which is on the reading list. And that goes comprehensively through the whole history of this. And if you can go further in terms of quantitatively weighing up all the different lines of evidence that he assembles, I'd love to see it. He probably would too. So that's something you might consider doing. Okay, now let's switch gears. Abduction and a chemical and biological weapons investigation. So this will be the yellow rain business. This is a complicated slide, so let me say a bit about this. Right at the start, it lists 3 alternative hypotheses. So that ought to tell you that this is not a slide that's going to be a historical sequence. But the historical sequence went the following way. Hypothesis number 1, chemical and toxin agents used intentionally in Laos, Cambodia, Afghanistan during the period 1975 to 85. Okay, so that's the opening shot. Then the first claim is there were what are called trichothecene mycotoxins that were used, and that's the chemical agent. So let's start with a minute or so on what exactly is that. Okay, trichothecene mycotoxins, they are, how to discuss this simply. They're produced by multiple species of fungi, actually, and they appear on plants naturally, in fact, in all of these places. If you happen to be ingesting wheat or some crop or some vegetable that has some of these mycotoxins on it, and in a sufficiently high dose, they will inhibit protein synthesis in you. Now, that's not something you can stand very long before you're dead. So the fact that you have these trichothecene mycotoxins present in the natural environment, it's clear that they're not there to such an extent that they're doing in local populations, at least under normal conditions. So the claim is that, in fact, weapons-grade mycotoxins were produced. They were released from airplanes that flew over parts of Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Afghanistan during this 10-year period. And the contention is that that's the high-grade, if you like, purified mycotoxins were what did some of the locals in. And that was, in fact, the public claim actually coming from the U.S. government. Intent to kill and injure, to frighten, target animals, crops, foliage, all of that. And the claim was the responsible party in the background was, in fact, the Soviet Union. So there's one hypothesis. Yellow rain was a naturally occurring event. That's the second one. Now, where does that come from? Matt Messelson, a quite well-known molecular biologist at Harvard University, decided to run his own investigation in this area. And this is not the first time he had run an investigation about chemical and biological weapons. He was, in fact, responsible for one focused on anthrax, an anthrax release in Sverdlovsk in Siberia, as a completely separate activity. But on the yellow rain in fact, the word yellow rain, it actually came from his investigation. He said he wasn't so sure that this was a chemical and or biological weapons release, but he was going to probe around and see what he could find. And among the major things found was that, in fact, there are bees in Laos, in Cambodia, in Thailand, that defecate en masse. And the defecation, it comes out as a yellow powder. And so what does the yellow powder, or the color yellow, have to do? Well, a lot of the reports from the people in these communities said it was yellow powder from planes as well. So you got so-called yellow powder from planes, and you got, in effect, bee feces. And Messelson had stuck very strongly to this claim that all this stuff about chemical weapons and so on, it's all nonsense. This is really just bees defecating. Well, you run into a bit of trouble with that, which is something that he's never responded to, namely that Afghanistan is one of the countries that's involved here, and the bees are not in Afghanistan. Yet you do have the same phenomena with regard to the illnesses and so on of people in the communities in Afghanistan that you do in the other places. So it does raise some initial a priori question about hypothesis number 2. Hypothesis 3 is that the events, in fact, were fabricated. And you ask, well, why would that be? Why would you get these kinds of reports? You had a lot of people in all countries involved seeking political asylum. And so in Afghanistan, you had the Mujahideen at the time engaged with Soviet military. And so some of those are looking for political asylum. At the same time, you got the Pathet Lao and the Hmong in Laos. And also at the same time, you have Vietnamese in the Khmer Rouge going in Cambodia. So in all places, there's potential to be gained by claiming things like this to facilitate political asylum. That's not a minor aside. It was a major aspect of this. So part of the problem here then is to be able to adjudicate among these various claims and ask, well, what's the kind of evidence that can be brought to bear on this? First, a few words about things that actually cause some problems, at least for hypothesis 2. Yellow rain attacks by year. So this tells you where they went on. And so this is obviously from reports in these various communities. You see big spikes in particularly in Laos. Laos has it all the way from the beginning with a big spike in 1978, then more in 1980, and another big one in 1982, and so on. And then from the other countries, you do have some modest stuff. Thailand has the least, and we'll see why from a map in a second. But Cambodia and Afghanistan are also certainly well in there. So this is when you see reported attacks. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this is attacks by month and location within 1 year. Now, that causes trouble for the bees because you don't have that going on a year-round basis, but you do have attacks going on a year-round basis. But let's not throw the bees out, immediately. The red dots on here are all places where there were reported attacks by whatever in Cambodia and Laos, and you only have a few places just over the Laos border with Thailand and over the Cambodian border, so that's why there's not much showing on Thailand. The red dots here tell you reported attacks in Afghanistan, and so that's where it starts before a lot of evidence comes into place. Now, we said yellow rain, and there's evidence blocks here. Now, where does all this come from? Up until it's about 1999 or 2000, you kind of had a stalemate with a lot of missing information with regard to what's the evidence you could even bring to bear on this. Well, the history of this is, I had a very good graduate student at Princeton, Rebecca Katz, who worked for the she worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency, and she managed to convince them to declassify 8,529 pages of previously classified documents about all of this. And it's split into information of a wide variety of kinds. Toxicological analysis, where you actually would have lab assays to see, are you finding evidence of these mycotoxins? There's intelligence reports, there's interviews with Hmong, there are medical records for people who were there, clinical ones. There's some evidence of Soviet linkage, there's investigator interviews, the attack data, coincidence analysis, which we'll get into in a couple of minutes. There's autopsy results, there were deaths there, description of sampling methods, and so on. So there's, in this instance, a classification of 12 kinds of evidence. Now, we could have made a panel like this that went with the Bali irrigation system. I didn't take the trouble to do that, but any of you could if you wanted to, and if you go get Lansing's book, you'll have no trouble putting it together. It won't be quite as fancy as this, but there's a lot of stuff there. So if you wanted to imitate what we're talking about now on the Bali irrigation, it's doable. Now, I'm sure you can't read this, but let me just say, tell you a couple of things that are on here. Under coincidence analysis, what does this mean? There needs to be consistency among claims about what happened from people who are in different countries, in Laos, in Cambodia, in Afghanistan. They're not all communicating with each other, but the reports line up with an enormous consistency, hence the expression coincidence statements. Medical records, there are clinical complaints and findings that were consistent with exposure to a chemical or toxin attack, but it is possible that symptoms were of natural origin, including illnesses, deaths, and the clinical complaints, there's a lot of evidence around that it's real complaints, that those weren't fabricated. Toxicological analysis, that's the first one. Mycotoxins were found, but the sample analysis program could not conclusively say they were not from the environment. So you've got strong chemical testing you can do, but it's not fully clear that they didn't come just from the local environment. Now, a bit about the toxicological analysis and the lab analysis. Anybody that wanted to do this rigorously, if you're, think of this as like a scene of a crime. What you wanted to know is a chain of custody from the time you get the sample till it gets in a lab where the analysis is. That wasn't always the case here, because you have a long chain of custody, often through people that it's not clear the extent to which you can totally trust what the trajectory was of given samples into a lab for analysis. So that's one of the sources of, if you like, dubiousness or uncertainty that's going to enter into this picture. We go a bit further. With all of these kinds of, the different kinds of evidence, we want to introduce a scoring scheme. And now we're going to introduce a scoring scheme in two different ways. For a given body of evidence, you want to have what we will refer to as a degree of dubiousness score. And this is to leave out fabrication of any kind. Just in terms of the information that's available, to what extent do you trust it? Now, the following may make you very uncomfortable, but I don't know how to make this any more precise. You would say, where are those scores going to come from? These scores came from the investigators, and so this means it's Rebecca Katz and myself going through 8,500 pages of material, and also in some consultation with people from the Defense Intelligence Agency. And so you will find degree of dubiousness scores where the lowest score of 1 goes with something you're going to say has the most doubt and uncertainty associated with it. Now you say quantify that, you know, compute a variance. There's no variance to compute. I mean, this is subjective judgment, and I don't know any way out of that. Medical records get a bit of a better score. They're scored as a 2. The toxicological analysis actually hit the high part, and also the sampling methods, they got 3s. So dubious scores can be 1, 2, 3. So it's a rank order. Then degree of fallacy. Now this deals with the question of possible deception. Something that scores a 1 on degree of fallacy is something you basically are going to say, I don't trust this stuff at all. Something that scores a 2, you're not sure if the extent of deception, you think there may be some, but a lot of it may be okay. And if you score, you can go up to a 3 or a 4 on degree of fallacy, and if you're at a 4, you say, this is clean stuff. Okay. So once you've done this scoring, you compute what's called a Veritas score, which means sum up the degree of fallacy and the degree of dubiousness. And then we created something called Veritas rank. High, medium, or low was according to the following scheme. A Veritas score of 6 or 7, trustworthy stuff pretty much all around. Got a high Veritas score. If you got a 4 or a 5, that was medium. A 2 or a 3 corresponded to low. You can quarrel in all ways about this scoring scheme. I'm open to it. I'll tell you a bit about controversy that's come from that in a minute, but in any event, this is actually what was done. So then the other additional thing you have to do, going with each of the hypotheses and each of the kinds of evidence, you ask, how strong is the association between the evidence you've got and the particular hypothesis? Sometimes it's high, sometimes it's medium, and sometimes it's low. So this chart has hypothesis 1 with medium Veritas, for example, up here, strong association on the right. So this is the middle part of the hypothesis 1 with intentional attacks. Toxicological analysis got medium association, high Veritas, and so on. So you go through this exercise with hypotheses, with all 3 of the hypotheses, and when you get all done, then another place, some subjective judgment. Here's a scoring scheme, which is by no means the unique thing you could do, but the order relations among the squares in this 3 by 3 array must be preserved. And that is, for every one of the, every one of the association by Veritas categories, and you had 12 of them, strong association and strong Veritas, high Veritas score got a 10, down to the point where you had weak association and low Veritas, that scored 0. You could change the actual numbers here, but as long as you prefer maintain the rank order scheme, that seems to be a way to at least summarize the combination of association by Veritas. Then you come kind of to the punchline here. So we weigh all this up. Hypotheses evaluated. First separately. For hypothesis 1, you ask, compute the following statistics. What's the maximum of the scores that are associated with hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, and hypothesis 3? What scores are we talking about? It's basically from this classification. So you find among all the different domains of evidence, the maximum that you got supporting hypothesis 1 was a 10. The maximum supporting hypotheses 2 and 3 were an 8. If you ask what's the minimum, the worst case, well, you got as low as a 4 on hypothesis 1. This doesn't tell you which ones are the evidence blocks, but it just says you got down low to a 4. Hypothesis 2, you got down to a 2. In pure fabrication, you got a 0. Then there's average scores. Average over minimum support cells. What do we mean by that? Minimum support means the white outer boundary here. So it's either weak association or low veritas or both. The higher ones are the ones shaded. So that gives you a whole set of, if you like, statistics here. Then, and then you have percent of evidence blocks and strong support cells. The rank ordering is always the same, looking at one hypothesis at a time. And where it says H1, H2, and H3 at the bottom there, that simply lists which evidence blocks are involved with that hypothesis. Now you get a bit more stringent. You would like to look at hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2 together. You have a smaller list of evidence blocks that are going to enter. That's this line here, 1 and 3, 2 and 3, and so on. And then you ask, well, if you look at the scoring scheme, now what starts to stick out at you in terms of which hypothesis is winning when you compare them on evidence blocks where 2 evidence blocks work at the same time. And finally, you go with all 3 hypotheses together. If your blocks common to all 3, this is evidence blocks, there's just 4 of these. And then you still see the same pattern. So on the basis of this kind of quantitative story, you come out and you say, well, it looks like hypothesis 1 is definitely the winner. So the Soviet Union is implicated as a result of this analysis. And the question is, you know, how confident really are you? And how could you nail this down in any sharper way? Well, to give you an answer to that, well, I don't actually know a full answer, but let me just tell you a little bit about another investigation where this kind of analysis was carried out and where a definitive answer eventually was forthcoming. This is...
Sorry to interrupt. The intentional fabrication parts that involved a certain government agency with the Free Water Act.
Yes.
I mean, if somebody really believed that, couldn't they claim that every single piece of evidence was fabricated, including the autopsy report? Or put differently, relative to hypothesis 3 has one.
They didn't say all kinds were fabricated.
Pardon me?
On intelligence reports, yes, so, those weren't totally dismissed.
Okay. What I meant was, suppose I was paranoid about the CIA knocked the whole thing. And wouldn't that include the autopsy reports?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
If you want to, I mean, the CIA could lie to you about it.
So maybe I'm asking the question, right? You're assessing from the perspective of hypothesis 3, that would seem to have some bearing on if 3 is true, these numbers have.
If 3 is true, you would change the numbers. Yes. So you can challenge the analysts and say that we didn't think 3 was true. Well, there was some we thought there was some fabrication, but by no means a complete whitewash.
The way you interpret those numbers, given 3 had an implication for the
Yes.
Okay.
Are we okay?
Yeah.
So why do you present this hypothesis at all? If you don't,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Why do you present this hypothesis 3, if it's not really on the table?
Well, at the start, I think you'd like to take as agnostic a view as possible. and say, okay, let's allow for the possibility that it is total fabrication. For myself, I didn't think it was. But I thought, let's play out just, if you go through all the blocks of evidence that are there, and so it's all through 8,500 pages of material, you know, it's not obvious until you really dig into it, you know, that maybe it isn't all fabrication. So we thought, okay, leave it in there. It doesn't do well, according to at least our view of it. Let me just say with regard to our view of it, there's a published paper that is, I think, posted on the website about the yellow rain controversy, Rebecca Katz and myself, and all 8,500 pages of material that we used is posted on the journal website. So anybody can go and check. So we actually have annotated reasons for our choices for these. So anybody who wants to challenge what's there, you know, good luck, go ahead. What I have found interesting, you know, having mentioned Messel's strong claims about bee defecation, hypothesis 2, is that paper has now been out, what, 6 years or so. There has been no published attempt at the refutation of what's been said there, which I find curious. And anyway, so the other thing that happened with regard to this, before I tell you about getting to the end point and dealing with Sverdlovsk, we both got a lot of communication, email and telephone, for people who were in military intelligence while this investigation was going on and who were responsible for pieces of it. And what they all had in common was they said this was the first time they've ever seen kind of a comprehensive layout of all the different forms of evidence. Because, you know, they themselves wondered, because they just have one slice of it. And you can then raise the question in terms of the way the U.S. intelligence system is set up now. To what extent is there a sharing of information that's equivalent to the release of all these documents? And the answer is there isn't. So, I mean, this is a relatively non-controversial thing, I think, now, because you're talking about something 1985 to the present. So it's 27 years ago, and, you know, I think nobody cares. So that was one of the reasons for wanting to go after it. You thought, okay, you can now sit quietly and see what would you make out of all of this. But I think one of the lessons is that it has to do with organization of the U.S. intelligence, and I don't know what to do about that. But I think lots of parts of the intelligence system have different pieces on every place they're wanting to run investigations. Yeah, Jim.
I'll just jump in for 2 seconds and then turn it over to you.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, one of the key issues behind this multidimensional poverty thing that I was talking about is the jointness of information that's needed in order to make it happen. In other words, identify who is poor or not. So suppose I thought it was basically very simple, is this person poor or not? It's almost the same thing, because you go to one ministry or another, and another, they may not know, and they can't certainly figure it out because they don't have all the information. And so some of these issues that you're talking about are very similar to the questions of poverty and how the Colombian government is joined together in a kind of way.
Well, let me ask you, is the World Bank in possession of all the pieces?
No, certainly not.
Or is any organization in possession of all the pieces you would need to do this?
But I guess there's a difference though, because here there isn't one truth, no? Like there's something that actually happened, where it's standardized on some of these kind of concepts.
Yeah, again, it's yeah, in theory, I would guess you're right, but still in practice, you have to make the determination. And so, I don't know. It's an interesting question. Is it all available in one location? Yeah.
I mean, if you can't assemble it in one place, then I don't know what you do.
In fact, that's been one of the big arguments in the pro and con. The discussion was, hey, the best evidence is going to be siloed for that particular part of the silo, and so you don't want to go this way. But yet, it isn't the best evidence if it's not all together.
Well, that's right.
The point that's being made by us, and I think is also being made by your example.
Well, I mean, there's a load of unanswered questions here, which I'm sure you can see into quite quickly. For example, should we be assigning weights of various sorts? I mean, I don't know. I mean, you can ask, where did the statistical scoring come from? Well, that's two of us saying, let's do multiple, not a single number summary, but lots of different statistics and see how they go. And they all go in the same direction. They don't have to. So, you know, it looks like it's fairly clear cut if you start to look, if you look at this. But
it reminds me of, by the way, one more thing. It reminds me a lot about a approach that was done by a guy in Mexico for well-being, where he also had this sort of layered scoring approach. A guy named Bolfinick, who's a sociologist, and he's used it for years and years and years to try to get a sense of well-being in Mexico. And it's the same kind of a structure that's in some sense unsupported, but it gets in the right direction, and therefore it's, you know, it's the best we have. So it's really quite interesting.
Well, I think getting in the right direction may be as far as you can go on a lot of problems. I don't think that's unique to this. No, well, let me just tell you a punchline about this that comes not from the Yellow Rain, but from Anthrax and Sverdlovsk. And here, I don't know the analog of what you would do with this in terms of the poverty. With the Anthrax and Sverdlovsk, again, you basically had the same kind of information. The details are quite different. But in the end, when you start, there was no bees. So that was a two hypothesis thing. One is it's really, you know, well, it wasn't just fabrication. One possibility, anthrax are present in cattle. And this was in an area with a lot of farms. And so a lot of what you were seeing, despite the fact that it was a clustered set of deaths due to anthrax, in principle could have been from the cattle. And then you had other bodies of evidence which said, okay, there is a building in Sverdlovsk from which it was claimed the, if you like, purified anthrax was released. And you had meteorological evidence that showed you where the wind was blowing, where the deaths occurred. Everything was downstream, all starting from this one building. So, I mean, you start to nail it down, and you do this scoring, but still, you know, there's enough there that says, well, the animals are not, they don't score zero. They score positively. So the discussion ends kind of where this does, except for one thing. You say, well, okay, there's this claim that there was this indeed release of anthrax from what is claimed to be a site of now biological weapons production, again a violation of the Biological and Chemical Weapons Convention done in the Soviet Union. But the unique thing that happened was in 1991, for reasons I certainly don't understand, and I don't know who has a clear picture of it, Boris Yeltsin one day said, yeah, there was a release from that plant, there was biological weapons production there, and then people were taken in to see it. You know, this is long after the event, you know, over 20 years after the event. But anyway, he said, so then you say, okay, now that does kind of settle it. Unless you say Boris Yeltsin's fabricating, but, you know, that seems rather hard to imagine, you know, given the whole context of this. Now, I mention that for the following reason. In discussing evidence blocks, this didn't only go with US intelligence. We actually had a lot of interaction with Canadian, British, and Australian intelligence who were involved with this as well. And the common denominator was they said, a final answer sits in archives in Moscow. Can you get access to basically the Russian archives? Well, to this day, that's never happened. I don't know that Vladimir Putin is going to come out tomorrow and say, hey, yeah, you know, we did that. I mean, you ask, well, if he did, who would care? Because, I mean, it's long after the fact anyway. But that would settle it. But short of that, this is kind of, I think, where it stops. Now, what makes people uncomfortable...
Let me ask a question. This goes back to the question which was taking.
Yeah.
And it's also an earlier question. You're flirting with the probability here of these weightings. You're flirting with joint probabilities with these weights. And you are kind of saying, I have a weight for event A and a weight for event B.
Yes.
And somehow you want a product of probabilities. And you're implicitly, I don't know if you're not explicitly, but you're implicitly saying, well, it's highly credible. They can sort of this event here, the probability of this event here, and this event here together makes it even more probable.
That's right.
So it's really like taking a sense and saying it's very improbable, I should say, sort of 1 minus the p in the sense of probability, 1 minus squared. But I guess the question is, why not just go all the way? Or is there some way to sort of go intermediate? Or maybe not fully Bayesian, but something that's like an ordering, like a little closer to an ordering on these events. That's really what you're saying.
Yeah.
So why not, I mean, for Bayesians were here, they would say, there's a lot of Bayesians in this building. They'd say, you should just take the prior and that's it.
Well, I can tell you, I have, personally, I have nothing against going Bayesian, except in this instance, what's even a rationale for the priors? That's what I'm not clear on.
Well, you start with, these are
You could say everything is diffuse prior.
a diffuse prior on a finite set, so it's not so bad. I mean, right? It's not like you're dealing with infinite supports or anything. I don't know. You have like a yes and no statement about
Yes.
events, and so it's multinomial.
Well, the probabilities, the likelihood piece of it is entirely subjective.
The Bayesian response would be that it imbues the whole process with conceptual clarity or policy clarity. You tell me what your priors are, and I'll tell you what my formal theory tells you should think about the outcome. Right?
Yeah.
Right, or maybe even something different. It's like putting your money where your mouth is, in the sense of saying, okay, in the Bayesian theory, you at least come up with some version of betting odds, right? They say, how much am I willing to take odds on this proposition being true? At this point, I don't know what your betting odds would be in. So you have this variety score. How does that translate into a betting odds? Somebody came along and said, I bet you 20 to 1 that the yellow rain.
I'll tell you, we thought a lot about that. And the reason you have these, basically this rank order scoring, is in effect an inability, well, let me just say it for myself, an inability on my part to put numbers on those odds, to say what my betting odds should be. I would look at that, I mean, it would be I could say 5 to 1, in favor of, 5 to 1 in favor of really solid toxicological analysis. Where did I get that? As opposed to just...
You're getting really close. I just wonder how close you are to that. I mean, in the sense in which you've got a system, you don't want to make it a fully probabilistic system. So in what sense is it not? So other than the fact that you could have sort of relative rankings of probability.
That you've got, yeah.
To sum up the thing. So is that what you want to say?
I think that's, my sense is that
Not the probability.
the ranks.
Yeah.
Well, that's what this is doing.
Right. But then I guess the question is, when at the next step? I mean, in the sense that you get more.
Well, maybe, okay. Maybe I'm too conservative to go the next step and put numbers in, beyond the ranks. And, okay. I wish somebody would go back to this original data and try it. It would be useful to see what they put out as numbers. Because, you have to give a reason for it as soon as you start putting numbers down. I don't know what it would look like. I'm not trying to, how to put it, avoid getting more precise. What I have put up here was an attempt to show, how to put it, an analysis which is about as precise as I think I could make it and defend it. No, it's, I mean, I'm all for going the next round, because I mean, one of our reasons for putting the original data up on the internet was with the hope that somebody would actually dive into this. Oh, well, actually, the 8,500 pages is a good number to just say a little bit about what comes ahead. And here you run into some real problems. As most of you know, there's a large literature in the computer science world that goes under the name natural language processing. And here's an ideal place to see, can you put it into action? And you don't only want it to be scanning documents, you want some decisions to be made. And with 8,500 pages, you'd say, well, I don't want to have to interface with all of this. And I can tell you, with the benefit of hindsight, I don't think I'd want to do this again. So you ask, well, what are the constraints you want to program into a natural language processor that's going to go through those 8,500 pages and basically come out with some set of weights, if you like, for 3 hypotheses, or it may decide en route that there's only really 2 in play, and it'll keep those. And of course, you then have to have all the software in place that'll do that, because now the computer's making the decisions. And on the dendral example that we'll discuss tomorrow, the computer was indeed making the decisions. And we actually spent a fair bit of time asking the question, could a natural language processing system be given an adequate set of constraints so that you could turn it loose on the 8,500 pages and come out with something you might believe? Our answer was no, but let me just say it wasn't without consulting somebody who knew a lot. Josh Letterberg actually was an advisor to us on this, and he was involved in the original dendral expert system. That's what the Mars landing. And so we asked him about that, and he said, no way are you going to be able to program this with adequate precision so that you could basically let the thing run automatically and kind of trust what comes out. At least that was the view as of 10 years ago. Whether or not that's doable now, I don't know. But I mean, to me, one of the things that I feel would be very interesting to pursue was to see how far you could go with a natural language processing system working on this data. Because, I mean, this is surely not unique. I don't know what goes on inside all the US intelligence system, but they're confronted with that volume of data and then some all the time. And, you know, I don't know what they do. Anybody else?
What happened to Nesselson?
I'm sorry?
You were talking about this. You mentioned Nesselson was about to be interviewed on public radio. There was a new round on this.
Oh, that's fairly recent, yeah. I don't know why. Yeah, he suddenly, from time to time, he feels he has to make a repronouncement, if you like, about the bee defecation. And both Rebecca and I got called from NPR about refuting Messelson on all this. She couldn't do it because she actually, half of her job is with the US State Department in the Office of Biological Weapons Research, and the State Department said they want nothing to do with this whole discussion. So I did have an interview with them about this, and we basically, what I've told you, went to NPR, but I don't, you know, Messelson, for reasons I don't fully understand, he's really had it in for the US intelligence system for a long time. I don't want to say it's totally ill-conceived, but in any event, so that happens from time to time, but no, nothing new definitive came out of that.
So I'm not sure why you mentioned the language acquisition in the program and stuff.
Oh.
So is it, I mean, I understand there is definitely probabilistic foundation to what accounts for intelligence work, but it doesn't seem to account for everything that there is in inferences in the intelligence work.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, where you could put this to use, look, parts of it you really could do something. Part of this is clinical records. So it's like doing diagnosis. So the same kinds of things you find in mycin ought to be in a program that's looking at this. That's one piece. Then a lot of it's intercepted communications between embassies, between different pieces of the US military, and some of that may be fabricated, some not, but somehow you have to decide which pieces or how you're going to weigh them.
So the computer science stuff is...
There's software that starts to do that. There's some, in fact, there's someone named Jerry Hobbs who in Southern California now who's developed a lot of software to do this kind of stuff. And in fact, just to go a little further with your question, there's something called information extraction algorithms. And basically, the US military has kind of run a competition among different groups, with the same information in front of them, asking who does the best job of extracting what's relevant information in an intelligence context. But I think what they've been using is vastly simpler than this.
Okay, so I understand there are different candidates to kind of fill the gap between what seems total evasion and what seems more the abduction nature of this work. But then wouldn't that qualify as an answer to why not go evasion all the way? Because you fundamentally do not want to go evasion all the way. I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be ranking, but it has to be something else, doesn't it? Or isn't that the line of thought?
Yes, I admit I was hesitant to go Bayesian. To go all the way. In principle, there's no reason why not. I don't know what a final calculation would look like. I mean, excuse me, you're not the first one that's raised this question. In fact, it's been raised enough that at some point, if I have enough loose time, I think it would be worth an attempt. But it would be useful to do. I don't know what would happen. Okay, anybody else on any of this? Yeah.
One thing that's been striking me is the similarity of this and questions of robustness in multidimensional measurement, and also to things in social choice theory that were very similar, partial comparability across people in Sen's original book. It really is something that might be amenable to a kind of, here's a kind of prior analysis, and now you can subject it to a robustness examination that would allow for a little epsilon contamination with the possibility of anything occurring. But
well, if you started with this and built a prior around what's already out there, that's a different game. I think what you had in mind was to go from scratch and see what happens. This would be a place to start. Yeah, there's no question.
And then you can look to see how far you'd have to move away from this in order to get reversal.
Well, okay, in light of what you're all saying, do we have any volunteers who would like to come to Gainesville, Florida for about 6 months? We could do something like this. Okay.